from France when he's able to. We're starting today a 3-day broadcast on a Ukrainian summit on values development in Europe in the context of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. And I'm particularly delighted to be here today, just in the context of where we are as a species, humanity, recognizing that we need more conscious leadership in the world. We need to elevate and evolve the human species. When we look at, in the world of psychology, it's well documented about child development. And for a very long time now, there's been an imbalance in terms of understanding the development of people once they've gotten through adolescence. And I look at Ken Wilber's work, Lisa Leahy at Harvard, and other folks who have been doing work over the last couple of decades on adult development and recognizing that we don't just stop developing as a species once we hit adulthood. So I'm particularly interested in having this conversation today around human development, adult development, and what does it mean tactically on the ground in this particular case in the Ukraine and in Europe. So I'm delighted to be hosting today's program, and we'll welcome our moderators and panelists in a moment. But first, in the tradition of Humanity Rising, I would just invite you all to just take a moment to breathe. So Georg is going to bring up an art card, and upon cue with the ringing of the bell, just inviting you to take approximately a 5.5 second in-breath. And then when the bell chimes, releasing for 5.5 seconds. We'll do 10 breaths just to allow ourselves to be grounded, present for today's conversation. Welcome, and thank you, Georg. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to have Katerina Yasko join us today from the Ukraine. She's going to be our moderator for the next 3 days for the program. She's a psychologist, educator, dialogue facilitator, civic activist, and guide into the Ukrainian history, culture, and current socio-political context. Her academic background is in the area of international relations and law, where she has a master's degree, She also holds an MBA in business, a master's in psychology. For more than a decade, Katerina has been an active explorer of Ken Wilber's integral approach, adult development, and Scandinavian Bildung practices to hold space and design interventions that foster social dialogue in the Ukrainian society. She's a certified trainer in nonviolent communication, founder of the educational initiative Empatia.pro and NGO International Institute for Integral Development. She's the co-founder and lecturer at the New Thinking School. She's a mother of 3 minor children, and after the full-scale invasion, she temporarily relocated her family, leaving the Ukraine, spent a year in Vilnius, Lithuania, supporting local Ukrainian refugee, the local Ukrainian refugee community and civic society through Open Society Foundation, Lithuania. Also joining us today is Auke van Nimwegen. Auke is in the Netherlands. He's a former entrepreneur, an organizational consultant, leadership development coach, and mentor. He's worked with Spiral Dynamics as a model that's helped him frame his work in organizations, as well as his interest in society, geopolitics, and humanity. He's worked closely with Dr. Don Beck from 2005 until Don's passing in 2022, and has been an authorized Spiral Dynamics trainer since 2007. He introduced thousands of people to the model and trained various other trainers. In 2011, he co-founded Value Match, which provides training and assessment services based on Spiral Dynamics. Since the Russian invasion into the Ukraine, he's been involved in aiding Ukrainian refugees in the Netherlands and used his knowledge of European politics and Spiral Dynamics to help create clarity around how important a proper response is to the situation for Europeans and for world peace. Welcome to you both. Delighted to be in conversation with you today.
Oh, very happy to be here.
Thank you, Tom, for inviting us.
So, Auke, do you want to go ahead and share some of your presentation and your thoughts, and we'll get the program started.
Good. Okay. I'll dive right into it. So I'll take about an hour to do a presentation on values development in Europe, and through that presentation we're going to zoom in more and more onto the war in Ukraine. And I also like to pick up on, first of all, on what Tom said, looking at humanity rising, looking at our wish for a world that provides us with more complexity, that provides us with solutions for the situations that we find ourselves in. What I'm talking about today is a story about freedom. And the first thing I like to say about that is that, when we look at these models that Graves found in his research, and also the work of Ken Wilber, we see that this adult development that Tom was pointing at is something that goes to you could say, less control and more freedom for people in the world. Right? But in order for us to progress, we have to clean up our house behind us, right? So the story today is one that will point into the future. But the first thing that we need to do is we need to look at how did we get where we are and what is our next step. Right? So let's start with ourselves, right? So as I said, this is a story about freedom, and this is a story about your freedom. I'm assuming that most of the people that are listening to this are from Western countries, are somehow living in a democracy, living in a situation where, first of all, you have the time to be here and to spare time to be here and to listen to this, and where you have the freedom to voice your opinion, right? So the Western world has a lot of issues that we will also discuss today. But it's very important, I think, to start with here, that we see that the basis that we have is an enormous amount of freedom that our democracies have brought. And there's lots of things wrong with us with democracies. I don't want to deny that. But the first thing I want to do is I want to look at what's right with it, right? So what is that? What it actually gives us, and in comparison to the rest of the world, right? So if the first thing is justice, peace, and social care, right? And again, that depends on where you live. I live in the Netherlands, which has a very good social care system. Some other countries have a much less social care system, but in most Western countries, we have comparatively to the rest of the world, a very good social care system. We live in peaceful nations, and there is a certain degree of justice. Again, there's twitches there, but on a large scale, we live in societies where we actually trust to go to the police if we have an issue, right? And we have prosperity, we have freedom of speech, we have freedom of movement, rights to individualism, right? And this is so much in our society that I think a lot of us don't really realize how valuable that is, because it's just such a given, right? That we are allowed to go on social media and write whatever we like, to a certain extent where we don't hurt other people. We have a freedom of movement. We can travel between countries. There is this idea that as an individual, you actually matter, right? You see, I'm using the colors of spiral dynamics here, and we haven't mentioned that in the introduction, but I am assuming some knowledge of spiral dynamics in this when you are attending this presentation. So if you're watching this offline and you don't know anything about spiral dynamics, you may want to just read up on something before you continue watching it. But I'll also try to explain much of it. So the third thing that we have in our democracies, and again, it depends where we're at, to what extent, but is a personal development space. We're allowed to develop ourselves. We have a space to fight for LGBTQ rights, right? It is. I'm being a little bit careful saying that, especially looking at the recent developments in the US around the limiting of certain rights, such as abortion and so on. But still in the US, there is a conversation going on about that, right? So there is a space for a conversation, which isn't there in a lot of other countries. Abortion, euthanasia, gay marriage, again, depending on where you live, but in generally, these are the things that we already have, right? So, and I think for the rest of this presentation, some of you may not agree with some of the positions I'm taking about, especially around the situation in Ukraine. I just want us to remember that all of us really want peace and freedom. I'm assuming that, right? So from a spiral dynamics point of view, that may be a pretty green view, but I'm assuming that as we meet here and around this topic and around, looking at ubiquity and humanity rising, we have an interest in our own personal freedom, but also in the personal freedom of other people. Right? So let's take that as a position. And then, of course, the first thing to notice is that those benefits that we have in our Western countries are not self-evident, right? Not at all. Most of the world does not live under with those qualities, right? So I just taken some situations here now in Iran, North Korea, China, where Uyghurs are being imprisoned and basically brainwashed. Belarus, this is Roman Protasevich. That's the guy that was pulled off a plane when he was traveling from Greece to, I think, Lithuania. Navalny imprisoned in Russia, and of course, the famous situation of Litvinenko being poisoned in Russia, being poisoned in the UK by the Russian Secret Service. And so we see that around the world, not everybody has the freedom to speak out. We actually, when we talked to Jim about this presentation, there was a friend of ours from Russia present, and although he has fled Russia now, he still doesn't feel comfortable to speak his truth here to a large audience. And just so that's the difficulty that he's experienced as a Russian, that when he really is free about, when he would come here and freely speak about how he thinks about Russia, that would have dire consequences for him or for his family in Russia. Right? So this is one part of it. And then the other thing I want you to really look at is that this freedom that we have is not self-evident, right? It is, and it's not something that came with soft means, right? So it is something that came with force, right, in the various places. If you look at the US, of course, you had the Civil War. Of course, it's a long time ago, and people don't remember it as such. But the freedom that you have now, the Constitution, the absence of slavery, was fought with force. And of course, in Europe, we had the Second World War. That we needed to free ourselves of tyranny, right? So let's start at that point, that Second World War, right? And I'm taking here a position where I just want you to go back to the start of it. Obviously, Nazi Germany is known to be, the instigator of the Second World War, but they weren't alone in that. They actually struck a deal with Russia, the Soviet Union, I should say, and the Soviet Union and Hitler, they basically carved up Eastern Europe, and they decided who would get what. And while Hitler invaded Poland, Russia did the same thing. Russia also started a war with Finland. So both of them were the powers that started the Second World War. And in spaldynamics terms here, it's interesting to sort of compare the two. If we look at Nazi Germany, the ideology was a lot around, being Aryans, being a super race. So that too, from a spaldynamics perspective, that fascism is really a purple-red thing. The purple being my kind of people, my race, my tribe, basically. And of course, fascism has a lot of red in there, about powerful leaders. Obviously, there was a lot of structure in Nazi Germany, the blue, but it wasn't, the ideology was much more in purple and red. Also, the Nazis were a lot into occult sort of things. In Russia, of course, there was communism. Leninism started in the early 20th century, where I contributed that to more blue. There was more of an ideology. It wasn't so much about Russians being superior, but it was about our ideology being superior. But of course, with Stalin being in power, and especially if you look what Stalin did in his 30s in Ukraine, where he basically committed genocide on a large part of the Ukrainian population, where a few million people vanished. That's where I've also put in the red there. And both were looking for, and this is important, so, and these nations based in either the fascist ideology or the communist ideology, they are focused on territorial expansion, right? So the idea is that their ideology needs to be spread, and we need to, the next nation and the next nation and the next nation needs to connect to that. Of course, when the two of them meet, then there's warfare. So when we move to the end of the Second World War, we see that Nazi Germany obviously was defeated. Somewhere in I think 41, Russia, Hitler actually started to attack Russia, and the two started to fight. And Russia pushed Hitler all the way back to where he met the Allied forces who had freed the west of Europe. And it's important to note here that the east of Europe didn't necessarily feel liberated from Nazism, right? Because Russia was there to stay, right? They first of all, the way that they moved forward with their army was very brutal, and they stayed there to establish their power. In in the west of Europe, of course, the Americans had a big influence, but it was, the Allied forces were Americans and Canadians, Australians, and all, basically most of the Western nations were part of that. That's where democracy was reestablished. Obviously, America had the US maintained through the Marshall Plan, maintained a lot of influence in what was happening there. But it's important to note there that the citizens saw the Americans as a freeing force. I remember, my parents talking about, the Americans and Canadians, rolling their tanks into our Dutch cities. They were embraced as liberators, and they stayed for, the American military presence was there for a long time, but it was welcomed up to a certain point. And we see then that in the East, we see more of, I would say blue-orange. So it's a democracy. There's still a lot of nationalism there. There's also, remember that a lot of these countries still had sorry, I wanted to go to another slide. A lot of these countries still had colonies as well, right? So now I take it back, I take it to my little bit of my family story. My parents were between 8 and 14 during the Second World War. These are their pictures. And I was born in '63. And when I grew up, there was these hero stories, in which the good Dutch and, the bad Germans. And I love to read there are a lot of childhood stories, children's stories on heroes in the Second World War. This was one of my favorites, Snuff the Hons. This was a dog that was the hero of the story. So I've put the, as far as value systems, I've put the blue and the orange in here. So it was like, it was stories about right and wrong. The right had won, and the wrong was defeated, right? And it was very black and white, obviously. The other thing is that in that time in the Netherlands, orange was, the welfare of orange was expanding. I came from a very working class family, or at least my father was working class, and so as a family we benefited from that orange. We were lifted out of what the normal poverty of working class, and we were able to sort of move up and get a much more comfortable life. And obviously a lot was about democratic values, right? So now Western Europe at that time, just after the Second World War, of course, we still had all these colonies. And the Dutch still had Indonesia as a colony, and Suriname and the Antilles. Of course, the UK still had India, for instance, and one by one, these colonies became independent. And I mean, we could look at it from two ways. First of all, you could say, and maybe that's the most important line to follow here, is the European nations were defeated in all its colonial wars, right? The colonies won, right? Maybe, maybe on the back of what happened, in the defeat of Germany and Japan in the Second World War. But anyway, so they lost. The other part of course, is that when orange democracy is expanding, there is less and less space for colonies that are under the rule of an oppressor, right? So I think both things are there, but you have to realize, like the Dutch in 47, 48, they fought bloody wars to maintain their colony in Indonesia. So they were not, while the stories that I just, told about, these freedom stories that I grew up with, they didn't tell me much about what happened in Indonesia and that sort of things, So it was very much about our own corner of the world. It wasn't morally necessarily all that superior. But we did give up the colonies, and then of course the European Union formed to create more prosperity, to create a free market, and all of this was an enormous, you could say, orange expansion in Europe, of course in the US as well. But at the same time, Eastern Europe was still occupied by the Soviet Union, right? So the Soviet Union didn't free those countries. It either like the Baltic republics, it took that into their union, or it established puppet regimes, or established a sphere of influence that was all the way up to Berlin, and and even further west in East Germany. And those were very different places, right? So of course then the NATO formed to protect itself. People started to worry that the Soviet Union, with the wanting to expand communism beyond its borders, wanted to protect itself from that. And of course the Warsaw Pact formed vice versa to protect itself from the spread of democracy. In those decades after the Second World War, all the other thing you see happening in Europe is that the dictatorships that were still there in the south of Europe, like in Spain and later in Greece, they at some stage they dissolved and they became democratic nations, and they also joined the EU, and they also joined NATO. So, and again, all of that can be contributed in spiral dynamics term. You can see that as this growing orange meme in Western Europe. There's still a lot of blue values underneath it. There's a lot of nationalism in there, and still a large part of Europe's population, either west or east, is driven by blue values. But if you look at the dominance force in governance, in power, also of course through the corporations in Western Europe, that became the orange system. In this time, there were movements in the east of Europe to become independent, right? So to become democratic, I should say, not independent of the Soviet Union, but foremost to establish democracy. The Hungarian Revolution was there. Then the Soviet military came in and violently oppressed that. The Prague Spring in '68, which actually was suppressed not just by the Soviet Union, but the whole Warsaw Pact, except for Albania. They came in and they suppressed again the wish for democracy. And of course, in the '80s, we had Solidarność in Poland, first being like a union, then being in 1980 it was being forbidden because it was calling too much for democracy. It was too much, it wanted too much change, and all of that was strongly influenced by the Soviet Union, right? So you could say the movements within those countries, they were either through political pressure or through direct military intervention. Anything that smelled towards orange democracy was suppressed. At the same time, going now back to Western Europe, and of course this relates very much to the US as well, egalitarian values emerged. The idea that let's live in harmony. People are imagine there's no country, John Lennon obviously. So there is this I wrote green expressions, but of course the hippies, obviously places like LA, but also Amsterdam, they were hotspots for hippies. Imagine all the people living in peace. The European Union also started to more and more act not just as an economic union, but as a political union, in which its objective was to create a peaceful Europe and a prosperous Europe, right? So it was also, you could say, the project was also a way where the prosperity was shared amongst countries, although not every politician would have seen it that way. But that's actually what's been happening in the last decades in Europe, where you could say the more rich nations started to share its prosperity with the poorer nations. Obviously, there was also a self-interest there, because then they could establish business relationships and so on. But it became also, where it started as this pure orange project, it became more of a green project. And today we see, for instance, that one of the most progressive movements towards a dealing with climate change in Europe comes from the European Union at the moment. It's met by a lot of resistance, and it's not a done deal. But so the European Green Deal comes from the European Union politicians, right? The other thing, of course, the green values. Well, they rose against racism. We had immigrants coming from our colonies, or from Turkey, or from Morocco, and you know, the green movement was also about, you know, welcoming these people, not wanting discrimination. We started this anti-discrimination committee in the Netherlands because we also saw there was a rise of neo-Nazism in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. And it was a lot about pacifism, right? I myself was very much part of this movement as a pacifist. So you see here the PSP was a Dutch pacifist party, which was when I could vote in 1981, when I could first vote, I would vote for that party. And I didn't believe in war. And if we go to the next slide, then if we place ourselves in Europe in that period, we see that these hero stories that we had in the 50s and 60s about the Second World War didn't add up anymore if we saw how Western nations were behaving in the world, and specifically the US, of course. And it started with the Vietnam War, where it was clearly, it showed the shadow of our democratic ideology. So democracy had become an ideology, and it was being defended in a way that didn't fit the humanitarian values that we saw. Nicaragua was one of the, we saw Americans sort of, wage its war against communism by supporting regimes that weren't very democratic itself, right? And then in Europe, we had this arms race going on. And in Europe, we had this in the 80s, we had these big protests against nuclear weapons, and we thought it was crazy that we would just add arms and arms and arms, and we wanted a pacifist approach to all this, basically, I could say. And it is interesting to look at this, because that movement had different directions. Some of them actually idealized, Russia and Cuban or Eastern European communism. I was not part of that movement, and that is because in the 80s, through an aid organization that my family was participating in, I got in contact with Poland, and I lived there for a while, and I studied there, and I saw what life was under the rule of the Soviet Union, under socialism or under communism, right? So where some of my I would say more communist friends in the Netherlands would idolize communism, I saw with my own eyes there what the reality of it was, and how it was, you could say ideologically it was bankrupt. So the Poland that I met in the 80s was a strong purple. People had it hard. Life was difficult. People had to queue up for the most basic, toilet paper. There was a notorious thing that you had to stand in queue for hours to get it. People were poor. Meat you could only get through a coupon system. And of course, you couldn't speak out. You couldn't say what you really wanted to say. Russians were seen as occupiers very clearly. I remember my friends, the sort of the toast we used to do was, to the Russian Navy, to the bottom, right? So they had a big grudge, of course, against Russia. And within Poland, you see that the party system was there, but it was highly corrupt. So I didn't meet people that were ideologically part of the Communist Party. They were part of that party because it brought them advantages. You know, they could shop in different shops. And bribery. You know, everything had a price. You know, I learned very quickly that if I moved to my friend, if I wanted a new visa or something like that, I didn't go to Warsaw to get it. I was staying in Gdansk. There was a bottle of cognac and meeting this one guy, and the next day I had my visa. Right, that was a normal modus operandi. So the other thing that I saw there is, you know, I was 21, 22 when I was there. My friends there, we were all studying IT. They were in the Technical University of Gdansk, smart people, and they had great plans, but they had no possibility to live them in Poland. You know, some of my friends one of my friends was a young heart surgeon, and in Poland he could do one operation a week if he was lucky, and being present to it. And so he actually moved, in the end, he moved to Denmark, where he could become a successful heart surgeon. Solidarność was there, of course. Gdansk was very strong there. My friends were part of Solidarność. Amongst my friends, we actually freely talked about politics, but outside that circle we didn't. Right. And I think that's the, you know, so the reality of life at that time in Eastern Europe, because I think this values profile is very similar to the various countries was there, is that it was, you could say, a bankrupt ideology, a system where the party rules, but it was more of a red rule than a blue rule. And in the terms of, it was about self-interest. It wasn't not about an ideology. And orange and initiatives and anything like that was very strongly suppressed. Right, so you couldn't do that there. And okay, I'll just check something on my bandwidth here. Okay, good. Still going good. So that is the 80s, and so I wasn't part of the green movement that ideologized communism, but by going to Eastern Europe and seeing people there and, you know, meeting them, we also got to this point, many of us, where it's, you know, what is this whole thing about? You know, this is not about the people of Poland or the people of the Netherlands wanting to fight each other. On the contrary. And of course, the song from Sting, I think, will voice that sentiment strongly. I wish the Russians loved their children too, right? Because it was also clear at that time that, you know, Western Europe wasn't going to attack Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe wasn't going to attack Western Europe. You know, that standard had been there for a long time. The weapons were there on both sides, and we all knew that there wasn't going to be a hot war there. You know, maybe an incident in history could have changed that. I don't know, but it was, I mean, obviously, looking back, we can easily say that, but it was very much also the sentiment. And it's also, for me personally, allowed me to be pacifist, and allowed me to be morbidly against any type of war. And then in 89, the incredible happens, because we never ever in the mid-80s expected the series of events that would very quickly change Europe. And we in 89 we saw piggybacking on the openness that Gorbachev, we'll talk about that later, what Gorbachev was advocating. We saw that these democratic movements in Eastern Europe, they tried again. But this time, the Soviets didn't roll their tanks in, right? And in June of 89, there was actually free elections in Poland, and Solidarność became a political party, and they won, and Lech Wałęsa became their first democratic president. In August, there was this Hungarian pan-European picnic, which basically was a peace demonstration on the Hungarian border, and a lot of people fled from the east, fled to the west. There was the Baltic Way, which is an almost 700 kilometer chain of people holding hands through the three Baltic states, making a statement about them being being independent nations and wanting democratic freedom. Then in November, through, you could say, an administrative, so just backtracking a little bit, we have the Berlin Wall in Berlin, which basically was a real physical wall to stop people, going from East Berlin to West Berlin. 171 people died crossing that thing. But then about, there was an administrative unclarity by somebody on television in the East European Democratic Republic, and people interpreted that as, now we're free to travel to the West. And when the party, the Communist Party, was challenged by that, they didn't really know what to do, and they said, okay, yeah, you can go. And then on the 9th of November, the Berlin Wall basically symbolically went down, right? And people could, streamed into the West. There was this big party going on, and you have to remember that, just months before that, to travel through that, it took hours of being scrutinized by, I spent so many hours traveling from the Netherlands to Poland through West and Eastern Germany, getting checked under the cars, and taking they would take the whole train compartment sometimes apart. It was a very strict regime in the DDR, and overnight it actually disappeared. And of course, we had the Romanian Revolution, where the Ceausescu's police state ended. A Bulgarian Communist Party abandoned its monopoly, and they also in 1990 had free elections. So there was this big movement of democracy going through Eastern Europe. And then if we look at the Soviet Union, this you could say this whole openness started with Gorbachev being the first young general secretary in 1985, and having a very different outlook on life than any of the former general secretaries. I think in terms of value systems, it's Gorbachev was an interesting mix, because he was a Leninist. He saw he saw Lenin's writings as idealism, but then he also wanted to take Lenin's ideas into a more democratic, a more open society. So you could say, on one hand, he had this sort of strict blue part of communism, but he also wanted to take that into more, and maybe his values were, more green egalitarian, where he wanted people to be treated with, how to say, they wanted people to be free, basically, to express themselves more, right? And so he started two movements, Perestroika and Glasnost. Glasnost was openness, so and Perestroika was a complete restructuring, where he started to restructure the whole, both the economy and the political apparatus in the Soviet Union, which was in fact a very disastrous move, and some scholars believe that that's actually the reason the whole system collapsed. But to be clear, Gorbachev did not want to end the Soviet Union. Gorbachev wanted more freedom, and he wanted a more democratic Soviet Union, but still communist. And he didn't want to let go of nations like the Baltic states or Ukraine, which also meant that in '91 the Russians, where they hadn't done anything to stop the democratic movements in Eastern Europe, which wasn't part of the Soviet Union itself, he did. His troops actually killed people in Lithuania in '91 when they protested for democracy. So it's Gorbachev is not very much liked in a lot of Eastern European places because of that. But Russia, Soviet Union opened up, and then in August 1991, there was actually a coup against Gorbachev. That coup was suppressed, but then Yeltsin emerged as being more of a democratic leader. Gorbachev basically let go of his power, and elections were held, and that's where the space opened up also for the various republics that made up the Soviet Union to become independent, which, if you look here, the whole list of all these republics that are today independent, or somewhat independent, I should say. Right. So here, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, etc. So a whole series. And if you look at this from a values perspective, we see, and this is the interesting thing. What happened there is that by allowing the openness, which is basically orange democratic freedom values, where people can say what they want, the party system collapsed. So you could say the blue structure of the Soviet Union collapsed. The ideology and the whole apparatus that sort of suppressed people's individualism, it fell apart. And there's two things that happened there. Obviously, I remember being in 91 in Moscow and actually meeting a guy who was an entrepreneur. It was it's clearly the orange that was there. But while we were eating with him in a restaurant, these guys came in and they started to shake him down for money, which was the Russian mafia. Right. So the red also emerged strongly, not just through the Russian mafia, but also, the people that were formerly in the KGB, in these structures that sort of, kept the Soviet Union together. Those forces became free as well. In the 90s, we then see an enormous chaos in Russia, where there is actually free elections. Yeltsin is elected. The orange can flourish, but also the red. So these four, that you mentioned, that this country had no democratic structures. Right? It just had this party system, but it doesn't have all the other sort of blue structures that need to be in place to have a good democracy. They weren't there, and there were very strong forces also from within the former KGB and other people that just wanted to grab power. And so we see an enormous chaos happening there, and this is actually a period where Russians learn that democracy is chaos, right? So that's really the sad part of this story, is that the Russians, it wasn't democracy that was the fault. It was the lack of the underlying structures that they needed to build a healthy democracy. They weren't there. And it was actually the red forces within the country that would destroy the dream of democracy, you could say. Yeltsin, in the end of the 90s, chose Putin as his successor in the next elections, but they were a little bit afraid that they were going to lose that. Then all of a sudden, the Chechens started to bomb apartments. And there's quite a number of good investigative journalists that have proven that it was actually Putin who staged these apartment bombings, because what he did subsequently, he brutally attacked Chechnya, and he gained this strongman image, which made him win the first elections. And the other thing, of course, that happened in this period is that the state-owned companies, the oil companies and all these state-owned companies, they were transferred to you could say they were privatized, but they were privatized by those in power for those in power. So it's a small group, we now call them the oligarchs, that basically, you could say, they stole the state property of the Soviet Union, and they became the most powerful people. And the whole political system that emerged after that is, when Putin rose to power, one of the first things he did he passed a number of laws that would reduce the possibility of others through democratic processes threatening his power. Not just, in the end, of course, he also changed laws that he could remain president indefinitely, but also making sure that on the local levels, elections wouldn't threaten his power. Through the oligarchs, he got control of the economy. Then there's this mix of how oligarchs, take on political positions as well, and through bribery maintain their power. So you could say the whole the years after putting to power, more and more the Soviet Union became more of a red empire rather than an orange empire. Putin started to threaten his political opponents. He started to imprison them, poison them, kill them. He took control of the media, and all of that with support of many Russians, right? So I'm not saying that it was, from a democratic point of view, it was not so much democracy, but it's also what a lot of Russians wanted. Also through being presented with, through the state-owned media with only stories that were sort of, made Putin look good. So there was a lot of propaganda happening there, but still today there's a lot of Russians that support Putin. Of course, today is and what's important here is to see that Putin is a person who loved the Soviet Union. He was not a communist, but he loved the Soviet Union. So he was very nationalistic, and he actually sees Russians as a superior human, right? So he has more of a, you could say, a purple-red ideology around Russians than a blue communist ideology. And that's where we see this shift of Russia going from, with a dominant blue, somewhat red power structure to go into more of a blue, less, more of a red power structure. As one of my Russian friends says, the rules in Russia are there to serve Putin, right? So the rules are not there to protect people. It's not the blue that we know. That, of course, there are laws, but the laws are used to imprison people, to make sure that, now there's a law that if you call the war a war, you can risk going to prison for 50 years, right? So that's not a that's not a real blue values driven structure. Okay. So then the EU, in the meantime, the EU and NATO expand, right? So Eastern Europe quickly develops democracies, and I'll talk a little bit more about NATO expansion later. We see NATO is expanding, and basically Europe, were also with both the EU and NATO expanding, I call it the anything is possible 90s, right? So we have this idea that now this bad period of the Cold War is behind us. We don't have to be afraid of things, although Eastern European nations are looking, at Russia, and they're still, they don't want to be really friends with Russia. We can see that but the prosperity is increasing, and also the focus, the values focus, is moving away from blue more into orange and also green. So when we look at outside of our world, we start to trust people. And by the way, there's no joint foreign policy in the EU, right? That's maybe important to know for the Americans. There's also a lot of greed in Europe, right? So we have this idea, as long as we have economic ties with regimes that aren't perfect democracies, they will respect our sovereignty, and they will eventually create a democracy themselves. This is ID, right? And then we become reliant on Russian gas. Then what we see happening there is that when NATO is being expanded, and we're actually, there's talk of the US wants Ukraine and Georgia to be NATO members. Germany and France don't want that, so it's not happening. But then Russia attacks Georgia as a response to that, and the only thing we do is just some economic sanctions. There's nothing. We don't protect Georgia. We just let it happen as Eastern Europe, because we have all these business ties with Russia and so on, and we don't want to start another big war. So you could say geopolitics are being neglected in favor of economic interests, right? And then in 2014, Russia invades Ukraine, and it annexes Crimea, and the same thing. Stronger economic sanctions, but nobody in Europe or in the US wants to talk about stopping Russia doing this. Now, if you are a an authoritarian dictator like Putin, who, you know, from that worldview, you think in terms of power. You don't think in terms of talking. You think, you know, it's like I try until they stop me. Right? So to him, that was just an invitation. You know, Europe not really responding to what happened in 2014 was more or less an invitation to, in 2020, to try to take the whole of Ukraine. And he seriously thought he could just roll his tanks into Ukraine. That's also the intelligence he got from his intelligence apparatus. He could just roll his tanks into Ukraine, and in a few days he will control the whole of Ukraine. Right? And what we see here is an ignorance from Western Europe. This, you know, looking through the world through orange glasses, in which everything is about business. And we were thinking that for Putin, business relationship with the West were as important as the business relationships are to us. But it's not, because he looks through a red set of glasses and we look through a orange, or the powers that decided that look through orange glasses, right? At the same time, we're seeing that in the West, we have all these challenges, climate change, you know, within our Western democracies, we are struggling. We see business imperialism, you know, where wars are being fought for the wrong reasons, right? Where for business reasons, you could say. Human rights being more important in our countries than being important abroad, you know. And so it's climate change, of course, something that we need to deal with, right? So it's you could say that in a way, I would say the West is sort of morally bankrupt, especially towards the world. You know, if you look at Western countries, from, for instance, friends of mine in Turkey, they see the West as keeping Erdogan in power. Right? So they don't see a West that spreads democracy. They see a West that primarily operates on economic interest. Right? And in our countries, there's two responses to that. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there's basically two responses on this in our Western countries. And that is, on one side, the rise of populism, right? So where we say, you know, we fight modernity and we want to go back to, you know, the good old days. And the other side, we see that as an anti-imperialism, anti-authoritarianism movement happening as well, which I think comes more from green values, right? So where we basically want to get rid of the whole orange domination of our society. Both of them see that there is an issue with orange, but I don't think either of them has a real answer to that. So now we move to Ukraine, and tomorrow our friend Mikhailo will be talking a lot about Ukraine, so I'll keep it short. But just for the context of this conversation or this talk, I want to say that Ukraine is a very old nation. It existed long before Moscow did. It has a long history of fighting for independence and identity. So its culture is very old. As a country, it hasn't functioned so much as an entity. And then if we look at the last century, you know, Stalin, of course, they committed genocide in Ukrainians, killing about 2 million of them through a man-made famine. And so if but all through recent, you know, the last centuries, Ukrainians identify as Ukrainians, having their own culture, having their own language, having their own, and through history, you see these independence movements coming up, whether they were part of the Lithuanian Commonwealth or whether they were part of Russia or the Soviet Union. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, 92% of Ukrainians voted to be independent. By the way, also the majority of people, both in Crimea, although that majority was much smaller, but even in the West, and so the east of Ukraine that Putin now claims are all Russians, which it's not, the Russian speakers, but that's a different thing. I think about 80% of those people also voted to be independent from the Soviet Union. They gave up their nuclear, they were the third, after the breakup, they were the third nuclear power in the world, and through a treaty, called the Budapest Memorandum, they actually gave up their nuclear weapons. And in return, they got a promise from Russia and the US and other nations to not being attacked. So they got a guarantee to be a sovereign nation. We see, and that tomorrow Michaelo will talk about how the democracy formed. And what you see is since '92, the road that Ukrainians chose is very different from Russians. They were dealing with the same oligarchs and they were dealing with the same issues that Russia was dealing with. But in Ukraine, there was a much stronger development of, I would say, orange and maybe green values as well. And there was there's this traditional this traditional freedom feeling that that comes from centuries ago, where they have a tendency to kick out dominant leaders, right? So in 2004 and 2014, they actually had revolutions in which they stopped the authoritarians taking control of the nation, and they helped, these movements helped to restore democracy. Right? And so it's one of the it's a young democracy, it's a struggling democracy. It's not you can't compare it to, for instance, the Nordic countries, but it's very clear that a large majority of Ukrainians have chosen the path of democracy, and tomorrow you'll hear more about that. Then, of course, in 2014, when Ukrainians basically stopped Yanukovych from going a Russian route, right? So there was this treaty. There was a treaty to cooperate more with Europe. The majority of the people in Ukraine wanted it. The majority of parliament wanted it, but the president said, "No, I won't sign it, and I'll go for ties with Russia instead." And he was heavily influenced by Putin on that. There was a big movement starting, the Revolution of Dignity, and it first was about that treaty, but it later became much more of a pro-democracy movement, a democracy of wanting freedom, of wanting dignity, of wanting freedom to express itself, and that movement basically won. No, there was no coup. For those people that think there was a coup, there was absolutely it is absolutely not true. There was Yanukovych fled. There were elections held. Those elections were first for the president and later for the parliament. Those elections were monitored by international observers. They were free, and there was a pro-democracy movement going through Ukraine, also fighting against corruption and so on. The response from Putin to that a situation is where he was trying, actually through Yanukovych, his plan was through Yanukovych to actually annex the eastern part of Ukraine. And now he couldn't do that through Yanukovych, so basically he invaded first Crimea, and then he started an insurrection in the east of Ukraine, which was supported by some of the Ukrainians, but it was started and initiated and supported strongly from Russia with Russian arms. And he was actually hoping to gain a much larger portion of Ukraine, but that didn't work. The interesting thing here to know, and tomorrow we'll talk more about that, but just one thing I want to note here is that it's important to note that in response to this invasion, Ukrainians self-organized themselves. Their army wasn't that strong, but they formed their own battalions, and civilians started to support the army. And most of those people that were doing that were actually Russian-speaking Ukrainians, because that's all happened in the eastern part of Ukraine, the middle and the eastern part of Ukraine, where there's a lot of Russian speakers. So it's actually the Russian speakers that try to stop Russia from taking over. Now, it's really important to realize that when when an empire starts a war, it will always lie about the reasons for it, right? So we've seen US going into Iraq with a big lie about weapons of mass destruction. I found this thing about Hitler invading Poland, saying Germans who brought culture to Poland are now victims of victims or truly satanic terrorization. So he was saying the Poles were, which wasn't true, but they somehow were terrorizing the Germans. Then he said the Poles had this cruel character. They're shamelessly insulting us. And of course, the real reason was he wanted a larger Germany. So when in 2022, when Putin fully invaded Ukraine and tried to take on the whole country, we hear a number of justifications: NATO expansions, Ukrainians are Nazis, Ukrainians are not. It's not a real country. He has this alternative version of history on that. Ukrainians belong to Russia. We have to demilitarize Ukraine. There's been a coup in Ukraine. Ukraine wants to make nuclear weapons. It's also one that he put in there. Putin claims Ukraine is committing genocide against ethnic Russians. None of that is true. And on the other hand, we hear Putin more and more talk about restoring Greater Russia, right? Traditionally, the Russians have called their enemies Nazis. After the Second World War, where there was a redemption period for Germany, where they dealt with, they had to deal with the war crimes they committed. The war crimes committed by Russia are apart from the Jews, are very similar to Nazi Germany, maybe even more cruel. And yet they came out of that war as victors. And their story in Russia still is that we freed the whole of Europe from Nazi Germany. Right? They forget the fact that there was a bit of support from the other side that said, oh, well, Putin gives space to Russian fascists like Alexander Dugin and Ivan Ilyin, who they've created their own fascist story about Russia, and they call for this big empire. And the first thing to do to create that big empire is to conquer Ukraine. It's actually in the Russian army, the officers have to read this book of Dugin, which basically calls for Ukraine to be annexed. The other thing, of course, is that a large number of people in the Russian army are actually Nazi sympathizers, a lot more than there are also Nazi sympathizers in the Ukrainian army, but that's a much smaller group. Okay, so Putin has called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical disaster of the century, right? Now, a little bit on NATO expansion. I'm just looking at my time. Yeah, we have a little bit of time on that, not much. For those of you that are convinced NATO expansion is sort of the cause of this war, I would advise you to either read Not 1 Inch from Mary Sarota or to watch her YouTube videos. She did a very good investigation on that. And basically, the bottom line of that is there was never really negotiation after the collapse of the Soviet Union, other than about reunification of Germany and the retreat of Russian troops from Eastern Germany. Yes, there was call, the negotiators talked about NATO not expanding, but Bush immediately said, I don't want that. NATO should be able to expand. So there was never any promise made to Russia that NATO would not expand. The Germans wanted that, but the Americans said no, we don't promise that. And the expansion that we've seen of NATO, there were actually a number of other options explored, such as the Partnership for Peace. But when the Eastern European nations saw the aggression of Russia in Chechnya and other, former republics, Soviet republics, they just wanted to be part of NATO. And they've always been very adamant that, there's a danger of Russia attacking them, and they want to be part of NATO. And it's really important to realize that in this democratic movement of Eastern Europe, NATO expansion was actually a choice of the citizens. Whereas, where Russia has continued to have a sphere of influence over countries like Kazakhstan, that's not a choice of the people of Kazakhstan. That is a force that Russia lays on them. And if, like in Georgia, if Putin finds that those countries are going too much in a democratic direction, he basically invades them, and he makes sure that that they comply to being aligned with him and with Russia. So the real danger for Putin is not NATO enlargement; it is the spread of democracy, because the spread of democracy will kill Putin's power when it reaches Russia. The other thing, the strongest indication that NATO expansion has nothing to do with this war is the way that Putin fights this war. Right? It is the Russian army is extremely violent towards Ukrainian civilians. It rapes, in the occupied territories, people are raped, tortured, deported, murdered. There's a list of, they found lists of intellectuals in Russian tanks to be captured. Katrina, who was on the call here, was on that list, for instance. Ukrainian children are being deported for re-education, not just a few, but thousands. Ukrainian cultural objects are destroyed. Anybody that's aligned with government gets imprisoned, tortured, and if you're in the occupied areas, they've caused the biggest ecological disaster for Europe, probably, maybe longer, but maybe bigger in the south of Ukraine by blowing up the dam. And there's constant missile attacks on civilian targets. There's a number in the last slides. I have some links. There's a number of human rights reports that point to that. So this is not about demilitarizing a country. This is about genocide, basically, on the Ukrainian people to make Ukraine part of the Russian nation. But what's been the result of Putin's actions? Well, I found this poll: 74% of Europeans support EU's backing Ukraine now. So there's been the Europe has united, and NATO has expanded. We're actually now independent from Russian gas. Ukraine has shown, if anybody had a doubt about Ukraine being a nation, it has shown its identity extremely well to the world, you could say. And the other thing that we see is that where we thought Russia was a mighty power, and it's still a power to be reckoned with, it's not nearly as mighty as we all thought it would be, right? So when we now look at the two elements there, the standoff between these two nations, you could say, or the war between these nations in Russia, you see that it's very much fought from a red center. I actually put blue in there, but I would say red-purple more, especially when we see the recent Wagner revolts. The advantage Russia has is that they have a scorched earth policy. So the human life doesn't mean anything from them, not from Ukrainians, but also not from their own soldiers, which gives them the possibility for extreme violence and power. Right? They have large supplies of soldiers and weaponry. Sometimes it's old, but they have an enormous supply of it. But they are authoritarian. They're low. People are low in motivation. There's a very hierarchical line of command. Many commanders have been killed on the battlefield, and there's chaos emerging in the leadership. Right, and it's resulted in extreme loss of people and equipment and little success on the battlefield. Right, whereas, of course, Ukraine's advantage is that people are extremely motivated and extremely defiant. I've spoke to many Ukrainians in the last couple of years, and it's quite amazing to see how defiant they are and how together they are about fighting this war and kicking Russia out no matter what. And people make enormous sacrifices for that. They're bound by international human rights treaties more than Russia is, so that's a bit of an issue there. Of course, they can't. You could say, if you're the one that is fighting for democracy, for freedom, yeah, you on the battlefield you have less capabilities of violence, basically. But the result is they've managed to stop Russia against all odds. And I want you to make clear that it's the defiance of Russia, of Ukraine here, is because they really know what they're fighting for. They know what it is to live under dictatorship. Many older people, of course, still remember the Soviet Union, but they also know very well what it is to live in Russia. And for them, this is a fight for democracy. And I just wanted to finish with this slide, and that is that. So what we're seeing happening here is that when, through the spiral dynamics lens, when our societies are getting more complex, right, we see that the geopolitics here, the strongmen, the oligarchs, and so on, they in the complex societies they have less power. When we're in complex societies, we see that power goes more and more to the people. That doesn't mean that there's no corporations and political powers to reckon with. But if we look at this fight between these two nations, we see on one hand a red values driven nation that looks at the world through a lens of power, spheres of influence, and then on the other hand we see a nation that's fighting for its national identity. And so it's nationalism. There's also a blue component in there. There's freedom in there, democracy, and this revolution of dignity. And Michaela will talk more about it tomorrow. It's really about human dignity. So it is this direction that all of us want is actually what Ukrainians want. And this is I'll leave it here for today. I just want to I'll skip these slides. I just want to show on the screen this slide. This is a number of sources, academics, who can underwrite some of the historic developments I've talked about. And I've also have a page here with some other sources that relate to some of the slides I have, such as the Hitler speech and human rights reports and things like that. So just you can stop the video here and look at it. Okay.
Auke, I imagine that you want to pass it to me, right?
Yes, please.
And first of all, I would like to thank you for the depth of your research and for your insight. I personally haven't met a single person so well informed. I mean, in our common integral circles, Ken Wilber's spiral dynamics, nonviolent communication, in general, the peace building circles that I'm feeling like I'm a part. I haven't heard of anyone being so well informed, both historically and contextually, in terms of current state of affairs. So thank you for very much for your depth, and thank you for bringing the true voice of Ukraine to the international communities. I'm
very welcome.
Very excited and at the same time nervous because I have very little time, and I was planning to speak a little more, but fortunately I have written what I've prepared, and so just to optimize time, I will read what I've got, hoping that I will fit into the time limit.
Yeah, and we're fine to run long if you would like. So don't worry about needing to finish in 10 minutes. We can go long, and that's okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. Yep. Thank you for these supportive words. Although you have heard a little bit in the beginning, I was introduced by Tom, I would like to reiterate a few things so that you could feel into what kind of a background I'm coming from. So my background is in international relations and psychology, and I wrote my bachelor and master thesis on the genocides in Rwanda and former Yugoslavia. I spent a decade studying integral spiral dynamics with Don Beck. I got an honor and pleasure to meet Ken Wilber. I went to South Africa and spent time with Rico Philwan to study the path of Mandela, and since he was consulted by Don Beck, and thus trying to understand the legacy of how the social engineering offered by spiral dynamics could help societies in their transformations. So I'm also part of the international circles promoting collective co-creation and trauma work, like Otto Scharmer's International ULab, Thomas Huber's Pocket Project. I'm also the student of Gabor Mate in his professional training in compassionate inquiry. So anyway, my main focus, just to give you a flavor, it has always been peace, and I'm a peacemaker and peace bridger. And I'm coming here from this perspective. And I'm thinking that I'm speaking to people interested in sustainable peace and professionally rooted in democracy building, just as I am. The only difference is that I'm coming from a war-torn country, and I hope that this perspective might evoke some interest in you. I also want to acknowledge that there is a lot of frustration going on in me, not only because I'm someone living in a city that goes through a few missile shellings per day and often sleeps in the corridor with my children, but also because most things I heard at the previous Ubiquity Summit on Ukraine literally tore my heart into pieces. I felt a lot of pain and anger. So, I want to speak with you today, speaking my truth as a human being, and I hope that it is okay for you if it sounds a little intense. So in March 2022, I received several messages from my friends from Ukraine, from US and Europe, asking whether I was following the Ubiquity Summit on Ukraine. I knew about Ubiquity, but began to follow it closely only after that. What stunned me was that there were people from all over discussing Ukraine, but not a single speaker from Ukraine. So I wrote to the Ubiquity page directly, and after numerous exchanges with Jim, I'm here with you. And this is the first time Ukrainian voice is heard at the Ubiquity Summit on Ukraine, but I believe it's better late than never. So I'm very thankful for inviting me. I also would like to emphasize that whenever I will be addressing what I heard at that summit, I will be referring to the speakers of this summit. So when I will be saying you, since there was no space to respond for any Ukrainian speaking about Ukraine at this event, I'm using this opportunity to respond to some of the, or many of the messages that I've heard there. And I also have very little time. I also noticed a similar pattern on how many meetings within this community begin. There is a Tibetan bowl, breath meditation or self-reflection, and then input from Jim or other speakers. And at the March summit, it was also the case. And then speakers got together to discuss the importance to stop arming Ukraine, call for ceasefire and urgent peace talks. As a Ukrainian listening to the summit on Ukraine, I was shocked by the huge blind spots and unawareness of the context and history of the region, and often arrogance that was hard to explain. As an example, one of the speakers even mentioned that Ukrainians have a moral duty to cede Crimea to save the planet from the nuclear threat, because Crimea historically has always been Russian and populated by Russians, if not historically, but then for centuries. When my friend, I have actually many friends, Crimean Tatars, hear similar messages, they are pained and desperate, realizing that no one in these so-called conscious circles in the US ever remembers them and their families, the indigenous people of Crimea, repressed, sent in exile, killed, and colonized by Russians. Just as Kalmyks, Dagestani, Chechens, Bashkirs and other people whose territories were colonized by the Russian Empire, whose spirit and sense of national pride is undermined for centuries, resources stolen, moral and spiritual leaders killed, not to create threat for a Tsar. So let me convey two main messages. The role of discernment of what you actually support and go against is extremely important. In some cultures and communities like yours, people are privileged to do emotional healing work, meditate, and engage in spiritual practices before looking for sustainable solutions. And which is great. At the same time, it is often forgotten that it is a luxury, that access to emotional healing and self-reflection is a gift many don't have, as it is based on the firm foundations of ensuring human rights for freedom, dignity, and self-expression. It is obvious that true authenticity can only be practiced in a society where there are no restrictions or little restrictions or civilized restrictions for freedom of speech. I want to underline that freedom of speech, sex, religion, beliefs, and other normal freedoms that are fixed in the Constitution are the only basics for the emotional healing and authenticity that we're trying to practice in the spiritual circles when we get together and speak about peace in a foreign country in a different part of the world without engaging any Ukrainian into it. I want to, like Auke, remind you that freedom and dignity don't come by default. You have it because your ancestors have been fighting for it and earned it for you, so that the following generations could unfold human potential, self-actualize, and evolve further in their humanness and creativity. So that Jim and others could create Ubiquity University, meditate together, freely express your views, and care for any cause you consider important, and even comment that you're not aligned with the mainstream media, but that you have a different opinion. You're privileged to have a right to tell it publicly. Would it be in the open comments or in closed comments in the chat? But I just want you to know that it is a privilege many don't have. In Russia, in Belarus, and in other regimes. So there is something I want to share with you. I know that you would say there are so many deaths that were caused by this war on both sides, and both sides committed atrocities, which is absolutely unproportional, because Ukrainians do pay a lot of attention to sticking to the Geneva Conventions, to capturing, to providing very decent conditions for the people captured, and participating and initiating the exchanges of the captures, which is absolutely disproportionate to what is happening under the Russian regime. I want to also say that yes, many deaths have been caused. And if Ukrainian army would not be armed to use relevant, proportionate force for protecting our values and people on our land, there would be more death and trauma. Let me explain. The difference between most of you and me is that I lived in the Soviet Union. My nervous system and my genes know what it is like to be living under the cruel autocratic regime, to lose relatives in the Grand Famine and in the exile to Siberia. And I, the partly ethnic Russian and initially Russian speaker from Kiev, I'm not anymore by my choice, of course, could enjoy the freedom without Soviet Union and Russian rule after the collapse of USSR. I will rather give my life to the cause of liberating the future generations from the violent yoke. I would prefer a shorter life in full dignity than biological existence under a regime. So when you support or organize marches against arming Ukraine, I'm wondering, have you ever spoke to Ukrainians? those Ukrainians who are in Ukraine? Have you tried to deeply understand what we are standing for? Have you ever lived in the autocratic regimes? And please don't compare it with the US, because the situation with freedom of speech is in Western countries, how it is in the Western countries and in Russia just can't be compared. If not, please be more considerate and thoughtful with your peace for calls, or sorry, calls for peace. At least out of respect and empathy for the victims of the regime, Ukrainian, Russian, Belarusian, Crimean, Kalmyk, Chechens, etc. Millions, hundreds of millions of people. So my second message to you is my kind invitation to look at how, by your call for the ceasefire and stop arm Ukraine, humanity rising are actually accelerating humanity's falling. When I read consciousness from spiral dynamic terms with collective imperialistic ambitions of colonizers, invaders, loots, rapes, and kills, and when it is not stopped, humanity is endangered twice. Firstly, in relation to the victim that cannot protect itself. Secondly, in relation to the perpetrator who doesn't draw lessons and continues to cause more harm and trauma. This is how evil scales. There is one story I want to share with you. Just after the massacre of Bucha and Hostomel, just after it was discovered, my friend Alexandra Filonenko, Ukrainian philosopher and theologian, and ethnic Russian, by the way, was invited to visit. The local volunteers and military who were cleaning and demining the territory could not understand a few things, and they called him. By the way, both Bucha, Hostomel, and Borodyanka, they all have documented many crimes of young children and teenage girls, women, and men raped. By the way, one 14 years old was raped by 10 Russian soldiers, and the youngest victim was a 2-year-old baby. But there's something else I want to highlight. When trying to seize Kyiv, Russian officer corps was based in one of the schools in Hostomel. They placed their beds in the basement and mostly stayed there, but interestingly, they didn't use any of the school bathrooms. In order to do their thing, they went to the stage of the school theater and on the tables of the school rooms. But there was one room that stunned the visitors the most, and Alexandra Filonenko shared those photos with me. It was a biology room. As an inventory, it contained models of primitive people of previous eras. All the faces of Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons were turned looking at the excrements of Russian soldiers. Actually, Russian officers. I'd like to stress, not simple soldiers. It was professional elite forces with higher education and many years in the army. So what happened in their lives before that paved the way to what could be called a collective psychosis? I consulted trauma anthropologists and best people in the trauma healing world like Gabor Mate and others, and the answer was always the same. It is the result of certain power dynamics in society. If human dignity was undermined by authority, would it be father, teacher, boss, or the president for decades, when the person has grown in this power over structures and the whole society is built on it, on power over instead of power with. When he gets to a place of impunity, he would explode and impose his power over on others, firstly on his own children, his subordinates, and people or nature of the invaded land are just decorations and consumables for his ego and power-driven inner dynamics. And by not stopping it by all means, you pave the way for uncontrolled further violence and traumatization. So when you, I mean speakers of the first Ubiquity Summit, are calling for ceasefire and want to support peace by stopping to arm Ukrainians, you're directly contributing to scaling of trauma. You'd literally contribute to more deaths, more people raped, more wounded on the occupied territories. In our today's context, pacifism actually kills. So if you want to be of help and contribute to a sustainable peace, make sure you don't offer solutions without consulting Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians, the representatives of civic society who are fighting against the Putin's regime for freedom, dignity, and democracy in the region and on the planet. When you promote world peace through encouraging friendship with current Russia, check in with yourself. Why are you doing that? If you do it out of sentiment and big heart, then just get informed what life under regime is. Pay a visit to today's Belarus and see how it feels. Or join us on Wednesday and listen to my friend, Belarusian dissident Olga Karach. If you're calling for peace talks and ceasefire out of fear of nukes, then maybe let's look into it. I'm often reminded of Claire Graves' words that the true shift from green to yellow or to the second tier is directly connected to conquering fear and having courage to do the right thing, which is to stop Putin's regime in its illegal, unilateral, and savage invasion of Ukraine and help repressed nations like Chechens, Kalmyks, people of Ingria, Crimeans to get liberated from the Russian yoke. I want to finish by a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and dynamic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. Democracies needs to have guts and grit to protect the gifts our ancestors earned for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Katrina.
Wonderful. Thank you for being with us today, and thank you for sharing your personal message of what life is like in Ukraine. And on behalf of Humanity Rising, I'll make a personal apology that we didn't have you or other voices from Ukraine on programming. Humanity Rising is committed, absolutely committed, as Jim says quite often, to truth pursued, not truth possessed. And if we don't have all of the truth, if we don't have all of the perspectives, then we're failing as our mission and what we're accomplishing or attempting to accomplish. So thank you for being with us today. I'm delighted you're going to be with us, or you were with us today. You'll be here tomorrow and Wednesday. And hopefully you or other people from Ukraine will be back as we continue to shine a spotlight on both the history and okay, so appreciate the lens in which you provided that historical context, not just of the region, but of the human species. And it's so important. I'm personally committed to doing everything I can to get us to tier 2. It's the only hope for continuation of the human species. And I'm truly concerned that we've lost about 40% of all the democracies on the planet. We're seeing an ever increasing level of autocrats and other forms of governance coming into place and replacing democracy. And here in the U.S. in particular, things are at a fragile state. And so love to continue the conversation for as long as the two of you can stay with us.
I've been reading some of the comments in the chats. Do we have some time to respond to that, or
yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So there's one saying, there's always two sides to war. And I want to say very clearly, that's not the case. Right. So, and that doesn't mean that, okay, so let's go back to Europe, right? I mean, Hitler had a crazy idea and he had to be stopped. Those that stopped him were not contributing to the hell of war. They were stopping the hell that Hitler created in Europe. Right. So it's a thing, and I know this. I used to be a strong pacifist, but if you look through the spiral lens, You have to see that there are times in history where if you want a more complex, humane, peaceful world, you have to at times use force to stop the red elements. We had to stop Hitler. The US had to stop the exploitation of slaves. Japan had to be stopped, and Putin has to be stopped. Now that doesn't mean, and that goes to the other part of it, that everything that this doesn't make the world black and white in good and bad. Doesn't make all Russians bad. It doesn't make all Americans good or whatever. It is even so that we could, we could see a nation doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. I am sure that there is a weapon industry profiting from this war in Ukraine. And it's really sad that we have a society in which war means profit to people, right? But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't send the weapons. And I think this is part of second-tier thinking, is where we embrace the paradoxes. We have to embrace the fact that we look at the situation and decide what is the right thing to do, not based on our emotional connection, but based on the dynamics that are happening. So no matter how you hate American imperialism, there's many people in Europe that love America and love American imperialism, because it is the only thing that keeps them from living in dictatorships. We were talking to Katrina's husband from Lithuania, and he said to Jim at one stage, please Americans come and dominate my country, because I rather live under American influence than under Russian influence. Right. And so I also saw a comment saying, well, let's bring democracy to America. I know, I tears in my eyes when I see what's happening to America. I was there in 1980 when I was an exchange student in Michigan. And actually my left-wing friends thought that I was the devil going to the US because it was the big imperialist, right? Well, it's not the, I can distinguish American foreign policy from American people, right? Just as we can do that with Russia. And it is America is not anywhere near being as undemocratic as Russia is. So that doesn't mean that it's that we should stop fighting for a better US, because some of the situations that you're in are really, both domestically and internationally. I think the US has a lot of cleanup to do. But we have to see that unhealthy orange, which I think is the main force in the US at the moment, has to be fought by creating more complexity, not by supporting the enemies, or the enemies of your enemies are not necessarily your friends, right? So we have to live with the fact that yes, the US was wrong going to Iraq. Yes, Russia is wrong going into Ukraine. And if we could have used Russia to stop the US, we should have done that. If we can use the US to stop Russia, we should do that.
Katrina, please.
Thank you. Yes, Auke, thank you very much for highlighting this difference between the violence and protective use of force. By the way, I heard it very explicitly from His Holiness the Dalai Lama when we met in the 19th in Dharamsala. It was a small Ukrainian delegation and a very deep and meaningful conversation with him, given that he also had this experience of fleeing as a refugee. And as you know, the war in Ukraine began in 2014. So it's the 9th year of the war for us. So what he said, and what I totally understand, is that behaviorally, in terms of the actions, it could look the same. But violence and protective use of force depend a lot on the intention. The intention of Ukrainians is to protect the values, freedom, dignity, and safety, and the land that we love, the land that we feel rooted. So I really want to suggest to be as attentive and to promote discernment, humanity, humanness, and humanism and love is very core Ukrainian value, and hospitality, by the way. We're in deep pain of what is happening. It's absolutely against our cultural code. Although we have been rooted into the Cossack history, of course, and we know how to protect land and people. At the same time, it is not easy, because Ukrainian nation is quite peaceful and quite tolerant, and it's a huge Russian narrative that Russian speakers were discriminated in Ukraine. Overwhelming for us to understand the massiveness of this propagandistic message, because when you look at the scale, you get frightened. What is the scale of manipulation? I'm saying it as a Russian speaker, never, ever going through any signs of discrimination in any part of the country, and having worked in all parts, and especially Donbass is one of the places that I worked a lot. So my suggestion would be to calibrate, to cooperate, to check in with Ukrainians. There are wonderful communities of integralists. The civic society is very strong. Very inviting, welcoming, and open to cooperation professionals who would be happy to support you and us together in our efforts in looking for sustainable peace solutions. Just please do not exclude us from these conversations. Thank you.
Once again, I'm just absolutely delighted that you're with us today and will be with us this week. And this mini summit of today, tomorrow, Wednesday is very important for the world, for the Humanity Rising audience, and certainly for the Ukrainian and Russian people. So delighted that we've had this conversation today, especially appreciating the historical context, the personal context, and the spiral dynamics framework. It's a beautiful way of thinking about this, because it speaks to not just the conflict going on here, other conflicts that are going on in the world, going on likely in the future, until we can evolve human consciousness and help us shift to tier 2 way of being on the planet. And it's something that I'm personally committed to, and I know all of us at Humanity Rising are committed to helping with that evolution and helping humanity rise. So I would just invite you both, any final comments before we close out the program, and delighted we were able to run long and have this conversation. So thank you both. And certainly thanks to all of the people in the chat and people watching live around the world.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you very much for having us on. And our connection to Jim was because we were concerned, and although we had different ideas, or based our opinion on different data, I really appreciate Jim's openness to invite us here and to share this side of the story. And to everybody, I'd like to really invite you tomorrow. Mihailo is a fantastic academic who can shine even more light on the situation, and of course on Wednesday we will be talking about how we see this future. And my last comment is, to all the people that are concerned about what's happening in the West, yes, let's fix that, but also let's do that in a way where we actually move forward. And I think we have a lot to learn from actually Ukrainians in that, but more about that tomorrow.
Yeah, and I would like to close by the words of gratitude. And I imagine it won't be easy to take in this gratitude, given the words that I will use now for some of you, but I still want to say I'm very grateful to you as representatives of your countries for helping my country use force for protecting the values of democracy, freedom, and dignity. Military support is the only relevant and proportionate support that enables this resistance. So I would like to thank you and your leaders for letting it happen. And I do acknowledge the drawbacks. I do acknowledge that it is not ideal. The world is not ideal. The Western world is not ideal. And it is our task to make it better together. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. Looking forward to continuing the conversation over the next couple of days. Hopefully Jim is going to be healthy and will be with us tomorrow. If not, you'll have me with you again tomorrow on Wednesday. So delighted to be in conversation and really happy to be kicking off this very important conversation this week. So thank you, and thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.